Hello out there in Radio Land. This is Michael. This is the Street Preacher's Corner podcast, the podcast where we always take the long way around. Well, it's one of those episodes where we're going to talk about church history, in case you can't tell that from the title, whatever I decided to call this. You know, it is amazing to me, I've said this before, I'll probably say it again, how much of American identity can be traced back not to intense political discussions, but rather to church stuff. The ideas that became part of the DNA of American philosophy came from a lot of places, including the mistakes of the past, but they were refined in the realm of Christian living. And that story is one of these stories. I want to talk to you about a group called the Rogerenes. It's a group that probably never had more than a couple hundred people in it at one time, but it's a group that shook colonial America and sort of stamped their ideas on the American psyche. I live free today in part because of the efforts and the stubbornness of this little group of people called the Rogerenes. Now, what brought these guys to my attention, I was studying something else out, and there's a lot to look at when it comes to history. Every door opens other doors, and you never know when to stop telling the story. But what brought these particular guys, the Rogerenes, to my attention was that nobody seemed to like them. I was reading some Puritan stuff. I was reading some Congregationalist stuff, and they really disliked these guys. They talked about how disruptive they were, how rude they were, and so I just started pulling some threads. And what I expected to find was some real kooks. What I expected to find was some real whack jobs, and what I found was actually something kind of different. So now the Rogerenes they're named after John Roger. He's sort of the patriarch of the group, although he has a dad that's kind of prominent. But John Roger. Now, before I talk about John Roger, you have to give some background because history doesn't happen in a vacuum. The period of time that we're talking about here is colonial America. This is before the American Revolution. This is 100 years roughly before the American Revolution, when Connecticut and Vermont and New York and 9 other places were all English colonies in what was still called the New World. So colonial America, and we've talked about this in other outings, and we'll talk about it again. Colonial America, especially in Massachusetts, was for all intents and purposes a theocracy. The Puritans, aka Congregationalists, had come here to establish religious freedom, and what they established was a theocracy. And the official state sanctioned church was, at least in Massachusetts for sure, and Connecticut, was the Congregationalist church. So the Congregations were the Puritans. They were Calvinists. They there were individual. They had individual congregations, and the individual congregations were autonomous. But what you had was a very sort of a loose oversight government that would be like a board of elders sort of thing. You see that a lot in the Presbyterian kind of setup now. But they were one of the main things that comes up over and over again, especially in this episode of church history, is that the Congregationalists were supported by tax dollars, or, well, I guess technically it would be tax shillings. But anyway, in New England, you could not preach, you could not baptize, you could not meet to hold church services without either the permission or the tolerance from the Congregationalists. You couldn't be a judge or a mayor or a governor unless you were a Congregationalist in good standing. This is the world that we're talking about. And one of the things you'll see when you get into the revolutionary generation, they looked back at all this stuff. They looked back at the Roman Republic and how that fell apart, and they looked at the English Civil War, and they looked at this stuff that had happened just down the road from them, a couple of generations before. So you had this tax-supported official, state church for all intents and purposes for the colony. And anybody who was anybody was a Congregationalist. And if you existed as a Baptist, the Baptists were there, the Quakers were there, but you weren't going to be mayor of a town. You weren't going to be a city councilman as a Quaker. You're not going to be a governor as a Baptist. What are you, crazy? No, you have to be a member of the club. And so into that world walks a guy named James Roger. Now, James Roger is John Roger's dad, and most of the story is going to be about John Roger. But James Roger was a successful businessman, And he owned a baking company, or he owned a factory, owned some shipping concerns. He owned a bunch of land. He owned a bunch of cattle. Um, he was one of the wealthiest men in his county. And along with his wife Elizabeth, he had two sons, James Jr. and John, and one daughter, Bathsheba. Now, James Jr. and John, they were both big parts of their father's business concerns. And in that capacity, they found themselves in Newport, Rhode Island. And in Newport, they became affiliated with a small Bible study group. Now, most of these guys in this Bible study group were guys who were coming out of a congregationalist background, but they wanted to know, this group, this Bible study group, they wanted to know what the truth was, even if it led them away from the established churches. So, what these fellows had concluded through their Bible studies and discussion amongst themselves is that the Congregationalists, the official, rich, powerful state church, the church they'd all grown up in, that Congregationalist church was wrong. So they're wrong about a lot of things, according to this Bible study group. They were wrong about not requiring conversion for church members. The Congregationalist church in the colonial America did not require you to actually be a convert to Jesus Christ. You just had to be a taxpayer. You didn't have to be saved. You just had to be a taxpayer. These guys decided the congregations were wrong about having tax-subsidized professional licensed ministers. In this capacity, being a minister was like becoming a lawyer, becoming a doctor, becoming a auto mechanic or whatever. It's something you went to school for. It's something you were trained for, and you entered that. And you still see that today. You still see that in the Methodist group. You see that in other congregations, and there's and that. But what these little group of guys decided was that wasn't appropriate to have tax subsidized professional licensed ministers. They decided that the congregations were wrong about baptizing babies, and that the congregations were wrong about baptizing adults by sprinkling. Now, that's a lot to disagree about, but the most significant disagreement they had with the congregations was what day to meet on. And you're going to see this comes up a lot with John Roger and his crowd. This little Bible study group arrived at the conclusion that Sunday was not the Sabbath, like the Puritans said it was. A lot of times when you read Puritan literature, when they say the Sabbath, they mean Sunday. A lot of American church folks, they'll say, we had a good Sabbath. Well, that's not technically accurate. But anyway, this little group arrived at the conclusion that Sunday was not the Sabbath like the Puritans said it was, and that the church should be meeting on Saturday. Now, look, folks, I think they were wrong about that last point, but you'll see it sorts itself out eventually. The Sabbath is Saturday. So let me just say that the Sabbath is Saturday, and the church isn't obligated to honor the Saturday Sabbath. Another sermon for another time. But that's what this little group believed. They were solid on the gospel. They were solid on a lot of things. They were just confused about what day they should meet on. So I said, John Roger and his brother James Jr., they were meeting with these guys when they were in Newport on business. And John Rogers got saved in 1674. His brother got saved a few months later. Then his dad got saved, and his mom got saved, and his sister got saved. Sounds like the Nascimentos to me. But anyway, and in 1675, they became members of the Seventh-day Baptist Church in Newport, Rhode Island. Now, to me, as a modern-day Baptist, it is really bizarre to me that you have a Baptist church that are also Seventh-day Sabbath worshipers. It's kind of wild, but there you are. So you have to imagine that when you have the official state church, and you're paying taxes to this official state church, and this official state church has a meeting place in your town, in your county, that's like a public building, like City Hall or something, and that's where they meet, and that's where everybody goes to church at, because that's the official church, and without that membership in the official church, you can't do anything. And so everybody that was a taxpayer had an assigned seat in this established church building, the City Hall church building. And so you have to imagine all that. Just picture that world existing, and then you imagine that when one of the richest men in the county and the biggest taxpayers suddenly they stop showing up at the official church, it's gonna lead to some controversy and some suspicion. A little investigation, and it becomes public that they are meeting at an unlicensed church led by an unlicensed minister on an unlicensed day. And among other things, they are baptizing people by immersion, and they won't baptize babies. And all this is it's just too much. Caused a lot of consternation in the community. So that consternation shows itself up in a couple of really tragic ways. Now, John Rogers, like I said, he was the first of the family group to get saved, and John's in-laws were so concerned. This is the guy that's raising their grandbabies after all, and he's meeting with a bunch of weirdos that believe a bunch of weird things from their perspective, and they're meeting on the wrong day, and they don't even baptize their grandkids aren't even getting baptized. What in the world? And so they were so concerned about this situation. Of course, they were Congregationalists in good standing, that they convinced his wife to leave him and take the kids with her. So she moved back to her parents' house and she files for divorce. So the idea that divorce is a modern phenomenon, it happened in the 1600s too. So she filed for divorce. So now in the divorce trial is a very murky thing, because so she files for divorce. She has no grounds for she has no scriptural grounds for divorce. There was no law at the time that you could divorce someone just because of religious differences. But she's going before a group of people who are all a group of judges who are all Congregationalists, and she is telling them that her husband has left the Congregationalist faith and has embraced godless heresy. Well, that's something. And when John Rogers first got saved, he was so burdened by the sort of man he'd been. He was a grown man, obviously, when he got saved, and he was so burdened by the sort of man he had been. He went home to his wife, and he really bore his soul about what sort of man he laid it all out, apparently, about what sort of wretch he had been, the sort of things he had done, the sort of things that nobody knew about. He was so burdened by those things. He lays all those things out in front of his wife, and she tucked those things away. And during the divorce proceedings, she testified to all those things. So you have this guy who's a heretic, and he's apparently a scoundrel, or he had been before he got saved. And so she goes before this judge panel of all Congregationalist judges and says, my husband is a godless heretic, and here's evidence that he's godless, and here's evidence he's a heretic. And they granted her land, they granted her money, and they granted her custody of the children. That's tragic. I mean, you could stop and cry right there. Now the lady, who's also named Elizabeth, same as his mom, but she remarried, but she was so grieved, I think, by what she had done to this man who had done nothing wrong and who stayed single for 25 more years in hopes that she would come back. She was so grieved by what she did that for the rest of her life she never signed anything with her husband's married name. She would say Elizabeth, wife of husband number two's name. She would never address herself as Elizabeth, his last name. So anyway, just before the divorce proceedings, the family. So you got James. You got John, who's the pastor. Oh, I'm getting ahead of myself. Just before the divorce proceedings, they started a little house church closer to the house. They're in Connecticut, and John was the pastor, and James Jr. was there, the dad, and James Sr. was there, the dad, James Jr. Bathsheba was there. It was his mom, his dad, his brothers, some of their neighbors, some of their servants. Just this little cluster of people meeting and learning the Bible and teaching the Bible as they go. And they got some stuff wrong and they got some stuff right, like we all do. Uh, so that held started just before the divorce proceedings. Well, so during the divorce proceedings, they took some of the things that his wife had testified about. Oh, yeah, this is also an important point. Is John, as a heretic, as a heretic, officially entered as a heretic by the divorce court, he couldn't testify on his own behalf, because why in the world would you accept the testimony of a heretic, right? Especially when you're a theocracy. So John cannot testify on his own behalf. All they have is his wife's word of things he confessed to her, and based on that, they took away some of his land. She got some income. She got the kids, and John was arrested for some of the things that he had done before he was saved. I mean, just crazy stuff. Anyway, so now you have this little congregation that's just getting started. It's mostly family members and a couple of little outsiders. And suddenly, their pastor is in jail. And what in the world are you going to do? And so What happened was James Sr., is John's dad, he decided they would sort of assemble that Saturday, and they would sing some songs, and they would pray, and they would see what the Lord would do. And so this is strange. This is a strange story. So there's this Quaker pastor. They get up that morning. The little congregation gets up that morning, and they go to the place they're meeting at their house. They're meeting at John's house, and they're there at John's house, and they are assembled. They get the little chairs out, and they sit down. They're praying, they're singing, and they're just waiting. Meanwhile, there's this terrible storm going on outside. And there's this Quaker preacher named William Edmondson. And William Edmondson is trying to get from point A to point B because he's got this meeting scheduled he's got to be at. But he can't go anywhere because the weather is so bad. And so he turns off the road to find the closest house, see if he can get shelter. And it turns out to be John Rogers' house. And he knocks on the door, and they let him in, and he finds out there was a bunch of people sitting there waiting for someone to preach to them. And so he did, and he remained a friend of that family for years, which actually comes up later on. So John gets out of jail, and he went right back to holding church on Saturday. But because they met on Saturday, they felt like they were at liberty to, treat Sunday like it was any other day. Now, John had started making shoes as a way to pay for the ministry, and he also felt like scripturally he was bound to not just manage business affairs and be a tycoon, but he was obligated as a minister of the gospel to labor with his hands like Paul had done. So he took up making shoes. Well, he's making shoes 6 days a week. He's making shoes on Sunday. And this made the congregations very angry because not only was this guy not showing up for the official church service, but he was holding unlicensed services at his house, and he was working while they were all at church. And in 1675, Connecticut had passed a law against working on Sunday. I mean, literally, it's a law. Not just, you can't buy liquor on Sunday. It's you can't work on Sunday. And in 1676, John, his dad, and his brother were all arrested for profaning the Sabbath and for missing church. Because you were expected to be at the official church service. So what they did is they knew these guys had been doing this for a while. They'd been doing it for like a year. And when they finally arrested them for it, they backtracked how long they had been missing church, how long they'd been meeting independently in an unlicensed service, and they backdated the fines, and so it was let's see, it looks like it's 5 shillings for the first offense, and 10 shillings for the second offense, and 15 shillings for the third offense. And the Rogers family, John, James Sr., James Jr., those guys, they just refused to pay. And so that meant they were going to sit in jail for a while. So they sat in jail for a while. Now, it's worth noting that since the congregation was the official church and taxpayer funded, it meant that along with your land tax, there was also a church tax. There's another word for it, but we're just going to call it a church tax for simpleness' sake. Now, John Rogers would always pay the land tax, but he would refuse to pay the church tax for a church he didn't attend. And he also took issue with the sort of minister who would accept money that was extorted from the taxpayers. He called them hirelings. I mean, after all, he was earning a living making shoes to pay for the ministry. And these guys were, sitting on their duff all day long, wearing powdered wigs and long fancy robes and riding on the taxpayer dime. And John Rogers had great heartburn about that. Not only in his opinion were they doctrinally wrong, but they were men of ill repute. They were hirelings. But anyway, if you didn't pay your church tax, now it's hard for me sitting here in America in 2023 to imagine this, but if you didn't pay your church tax, the sheriff would show up to collect. Because after all, it is a state-run church, and so the gathering of the church tax is a function of local law enforcement, right? And so if you refused to pay, they would just take a sheep or a cow, to pay the bill, or they would just arrest you. Here's a great quote by a biographer of John Rogers. "It is evident that a crisis has now arrived. The sacred Puritan Sabbath has been ignored in an amazingly bold manner by this little band of dissidents who openly declare in court their intention of keeping a seventh-day Sabbath, and that alone, whatever be the menace or punishment." And so, true to their word, over and over again, Rogers and his family and other members of the congregation were whipped and fined and imprisoned to the tune of hundreds of thousands of shillings. Men in his congregation and women were both publicly stripped, naked, and beaten by members in good standing of the official Congregationalist Church. Ministers and reverends and holy men and men with powdered wigs and fancy robes. They arranged for stripping and beating of people who were just as saved as they were assuming they were saved. In 1617, James Sr., James Jr., his wife Elizabeth, and John were all fined for, quote, profaning the Sabbath, and by that they mean Sunday. This practice, in which people objected to being charged for participation in something they could not in good conscience participate in, caused a phrase to be coined. Now, I don't know if you've ever heard this phrase before. The phrase is taxation without representation. See, that wasn't first used in a governmental sense, and the fact that American people weren't being represented in English Parliament, even though they were being taxed to pay for English Parliament. That the original use of that phrase, taxation without representation, is people having to pay for a state church that they don't feel obligated to attend because they disagree with it doctrinally. See what I mean, Jelly Bean? America's a complicated place. So anyway, in 1677, Bathsheba, this is John's sister, she wrote this big. She wrote up this paper. Imagine the Martin Luther nailing his theses to the church door. It's very much like that. She wrote this paper laying out their disputes with the Congregationalists and their scriptural reasons for dissent, and she nailed it to the public assembly hall where the Congregationalists met. And it didn't go over well, but, as a Rogerenes descendant said, great exegesis requires extraordinary conduct. So after about 3 years of this treatment, about 3 years of getting arrested, of having the sheriff come up and just confiscate your milk cow, 3 years of getting beaten, 3 years of having church services disrupted by, raids, the Rogers clan, they tried a different approach. So John, his dad, and his brother, they all attended the congregational services. I mean, they, after all, not only were already paying for their spot, but as prominent taxpayers, they already had dedicated seats with their names on them. So they showed up, and when the opportunity arose, one by one, there's a period, I guess, in their church services where you're allowed to stand up and speak or whatever. One by one, these three men, James, John, and John Senior, or James, Jr., and James Senior, they stood up and they addressed the issue, and they wanted to know why their brethren thought it right to have them beaten, whipped, and imprisoned. They also wanted to know what sort of minister would accept a salary out of what was basically blood money. The life and toil and sweat of a man that you've extracted from him by force by sending armed law enforcement to his house to collect their tithes and offerings. What sort of man would live out of that sort of offering plate? That's what they wanted to know. So they were, of course, arrested and fined and beaten for disrupting church services, which, sort of proved their point. In 1677, the court ordered that John Rogers be called into account once a month and be fined 5 shillings a month regardless. Here's a quote from one of the biographers about this guy. Ecclesiastical history, whenever there has been an alliance of church and state, is blackened with crimes and cruelties too foul to be named. Well, there's a villain in this story, by the way. In 1688, there was a man named Gordon Saltonstall. Gordon Saltonstall was a Congregationalist pastor and a political animal. He was the sort of guy who would, I'm reminded of a fellow in St. Mary's that was the pastor of the Methodist Church and used that position to worm his way into political situation. But anyway, that's the sort of man Gordon Saltonstall was. And so he was a Congregationalist pastor. He was due to take over the local congregation in that town where the Rogers live. So he apparently there's a lead up to this. Apparently, you get ordained and then there's a couple of years before you actually take the church. So in that time period, he starts to advocate tirelessly for an increase in the church tax because he wants to renovate the church building and he wants to purchase a fancy new bell to commemorate his pastorate with. So here's the scene. Right? The sheriff comes by for about the umpteenth time. Tells John Rogers, listen, you have to contribute as a tax-paying member in this town in this county, you have to contribute this increased rate towards this building program, and we're also going to buy a fancy new bell to ring in the new pastor with. And so what John Rogers did was he contributed a powdered wig. He said, "Let the hireling wear that to cover his shameful head." I get it. Okay, the guy is shooting himself in the foot, but it's just, to me, it's hilarious. So moving on. So that didn't earn him any friends. It also didn't earn him any friends with the new pastor. So in 1691, Saltonstall finally became the pastor, and he begins to hatch a plan to get John put back in jail. So he waited about 3 years and just kind of bided his time, and then he attended a John Rogers church service where John was preaching on the new birth. And John said that as a saved man, the same way that a saved man is a vessel fit for Christ, a lost man is a vessel fit for the devil. And so Saltonstall asked him, "Will you say that your body is the body of Christ?" And John replies, "Yes, I do affirm that this human body is Christ's body, for Christ has purchased us with his own blood, and I am not my own, for I am bought with a price." So that was on Saturday. The next day, which would be Sunday, John Rogers is seen carrying boards and is arrested for working on Sunday and for blasphemy. So they send him to jail for a week. So here comes around the next Sunday. This is a Sunday after John gets arrested. His sister, Bathsheba, shows up at the services at the Congregationalist Church, the main, the official state church, and she announced that she too had been laboring on Sunday. And of course, this causes a big uproar. About the time they're trying to figure out what's the best way to arrest her and what's the most proper way to address this, the back doors of the church fly open, and in walks John Rogers, and he's pushing a wheelbarrow. So John Rogers walks this thing all the way down the aisle, and he gets to right in front of the pulpit, and he spins the thing around, and inside the wheelbarrow are shoes that he has made. And he asked if anyone in the crowd wants to buy some shoes. Well, that's time when he was arrested. He was sent to Hartford prison, not the local joint. He was sent to Hartford prison because apparently the prison in Hartford was harder or something. I don't know. Anyway, so while he's there at the Hartford prison, he makes a sign and he hangs it outside the window of his jail cell. This is what the sign says: "I, John Rogers, a servant of Jesus Christ, here make an open declaration of war against the great red dragon, and against the beast who it gives his power, and against the false church that rides upon the beast, and against the false prophets who are established by the dragon and the beast, and also a proclamation of derision against the sort of devil's spirit, which is prisons, stocks, whips, fines, and revilings, all of which is to defend the religion of devils." I like this guy, man. What? How could you not? This is a guy you would hang out with, even if he was wrong about something. Here's a guy you would hang out with. Now, so when John Rogers was not running what was left of the family business, because all these fines were taking a severe toll on everything, when he wasn't running what was left of the family business, or making shoes, or preaching, or going to jail, John Rogers and his followers, they wrote and they spoke tirelessly on the matter of religious freedom. They spoke a lot and wrote a lot on the wickedness of a state church, and they wrote and spoke a lot on the necessity of a man being fully persuaded in his own mind. John wrote books on these topics, and his son distributed them all over New England. People who disagree with John about the Sabbath found they agree with him about religious liberty. I have here a quote written by John's son, John Rogers Jr. By the way, even though his wife had left him and took the 2 kids with her, as soon as those kids could get free of their mom, I think John Jr. was left at 14 and his sister left at 16. They went and lived with their dad. So, that says something there. But this is written by his son. This is sort of their position on things. "Now, when the worldly rulers take upon themselves..." I'm sorry, let me back up. "Forasmuch as we acknowledge the worldly government to be set up of God, we have always paid all public demands for the upholding of same, as town rates and county rates and all other demands, excepting such as for the of the upholding of hireling ministers and false teachers, which God hath called us to testify against. And when the worldly rulers take upon themselves to make laws relating to God's worship, and therefore do force and command men's consciences, and so turn their swords against God's children, they then act beyond their commission and jurisdiction." So if that's true, and I believe it is, I believe that Romans 13 teaches the limits of secular government as well as the power of secular government. If that's true, then in 2020, when the government told you to shut down your churches and stay home, you shouldn't have shut your churches down and stay home. See, this stuff didn't go away. In 1695, a special session of the Superior Court in Hartford, Connecticut, when John Rogers was tried for blasphemy with Reverend Saltonstall, remember that guy, as a key witness. He was found guilty of blasphemy because Saltonstall said, "Well, this guy claimed his body is the body of Jesus Christ. It's blasphemy," and that's because Saltonstall is dishonest and probably in hell right now. But anyway, John Rogers was found guilty, and he was sentenced to stand on the trap door of the gallows for 15 minutes with a rope around his neck. This is something they did over and over again in colonial America, and I don't understand it. Like, if you know they're not going to spring the trap, you should feel okay staying there all day long. He was fined 55 shillings, but as usual, he refuses to pay it, and he goes back to jail. In June 1695, the Congregationalist meeting house burns to the ground. John's sister Bathsheba was arrested, but no trial was ever held. In October of 1695, John Rogers was stripped publicly and whipped with 76 stripes. One of his adherents went to the Connecticut, I forget what they're called, the Connecticut Supreme Court or whatever they are, and said, hey, even under the Mosaic law that we say we're following, you're not supposed to hit a man that many times. But by that time, it's too late. We could go on and on. This fella had, been, having trouble with the law since the day he was born again. And in 1788, his adversary, the Reverend Saltonstall, was elected to be governor of Connecticut, and things got worse. But the ideas that the Rogerenes preached and the grit and determination they displayed persuaded a lot of their enemies. John Roger had 2 children and 18 grandchildren. One of these grandkids, an attorney, laid the groundwork before the General Court of Massachusetts for the case for religious liberty and against a state-sponsored church. Another grandson was instrumental in what they called the Toleration Party. The Toleration Party was a group that was dedicated to, they demanded that the Connecticut Constitution, the state constitution, include religious liberty and didn't include a state church. As a matter of fact, and this to me at least is what's fascinating about all this. As a matter of fact, by the time the political types started arguing about this sort of stuff in the 1780s, because I don't know if you know this, but the Bill of Rights that we enjoy here in the United States, that exists because those rights were an afterthought. They wrote the United States Constitution. They sent it to the states to be ratified, and different religious groups, including Baptists, including Anabaptists, including Quakers, including all these different groups, they demanded that additional protection before they ratified. The church groups in those states demanded that additional protections be put in for things like freedom of religion, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom to bear arms, freedom to all that. The first 10 amendments, those were the Constitution could not be ratified until those 10 items were hammered out. And I'm telling you, man, a century before that stuff was hammered out in the political realm, that stuff was hammered out in the church realm. By the time the political types started arguing about this stuff in the 1780s, the body of Christ had already been hashing this stuff out amongst themselves for over a century. So we don't have a First Amendment because of guys like Thomas Jefferson. Although as much as I love TJ, he's my favorite president. We have the First Amendment because of guys like John Roger, guys that not only believe things, but live those beliefs, even when it costs them everything. And like I said, I think John Rogers was wrong about the Sabbath, but I think he had a right to be wrong. Oh, by the way, he eventually came around. So one of those Quaker, remember I talked about William Edmondson, that Quaker preacher that was running from the storm, wound up in his house, and how I said he remained a friend of the Rogers family for years. Well, it turns out that the Rogers family had a lot of Quaker friends through Edmondson and through some other things that went on. and in fact, one of the fines that John Rogers paid was he paid a fine for having Quakers in his home, because if you recall from our Puritan versus Quakers Battle Royale podcast, it was illegal to entertain Quakers in your house. Like it's anybody's business. who you have in your house. But anyway, they continued that friendship. They continued these discussions. They continued looking at Bible verses. And by the early 1700s, by 1701, 1702, John Roger had become convinced in his mind that that Jesus Christ is our Sabbath, and there's no need to observe that Mosaic law in regards to the Sabbath. So he was wrong, and he got it sorted out. But even if he was wrong, if he'd stayed wrong, if he died wrong, the man has a right to think what he wants. The man has a right to look at the scriptures and decide those things. The man has an obligation to look at the scriptures and decide things for himself. And we have a First Amendment, like I said, because of guys like John Roger, guys who were stubborn, and guys who just took it because these things were important. It would have been so easy to fold. It would have been so easy just to go on to get along. Standing up for untold generations cost John Rogers everything. John Rogers taking stripes in 1695 ensured that I wouldn't have to in 2023. I'm going to end this with a quote by John Boyles, who is the grandson or the great-grandson of John Rogers. They recycled a lot of names in this family, and it wasn't always clear when I was going through the literature who was who. So we're just going to say John Boyles, and we're going to say that's his grandson or great-grandson. To rule the church by the power of the magistrate is to destroy the peace of both church, families, and commonwealth. So there you go, friend. One more example of American history turning on a dime because of some Christian with a backbone so stout you could see it from the front, taking a stand, taking the hits, and enduring persecution, not just from the ungodly, but from the brethren. So there you go, guys. The Rogerenes died out after a couple generations, but the ideas that they promoted are still with us today. Okay, well, this is Michael. This has been the Street Preacher's Corner podcast. And as always, I will see you on the other side.